The scrap of paper had been folded so many times that the creased lines nearly obscured the address written on it, and Owen Ramsey held it between two calloused fingers in the gray morning light outside the land office in Tucson, Arizona, in the autumn of 1882, wondering why a dying man's last wish had been to send a drifter to a widow's door. The man who had pressed it into his hand was named Clifford Purcell, a cattle broker Owen had pulled from beneath an overturned wagon on the road east of the Santa Cruz River 3 weeks prior. Clifford had broken both his legs badly and cracked several ribs, and Owen had carried him to the nearest doctor in his arms like a man carrying a sleeping child, and he had sat with him through 2 nights of fever because it had seemed wrong to leave. Clifford had lived, which was more than the doctor had promised, and when the old man could finally speak without gasping, he had gripped Owen's wrist with surprising strength and said, "There is a woman in Harlow Creek. Her name is Susan Fairchild. Her husband was my business partner and he is gone now, and she is alone on that property with too much trouble coming and too little help arriving. You go to her. You tell her Clifford sent you. You help her as long as she needs helping." Owen had not known what to say to that. He was not a man who attached himself to things. He had spent the better part of his 31 years moving between ranches and cattle drives and odd jobs across New Mexico territory and Arizona territory, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a mark on it. He owned a horse, a saddle, a rifle, a bedroll, and a leather satchel of modest belongings. He had no debts and no promises and no particular place he needed to be, which was the only reason he had been in a position to pull Clifford Purcell out from under that wagon in the first place. A man traveling fast and on purpose would have ridden past. "Why me?" Owen had asked. "Because you stayed," Clifford said simply, as though that were an obvious answer to a foolish question. So Owen had taken the scrap of paper and ridden north out of Tucson toward the small settlement of Harlow Creek, which sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges of pale limestone in the foothills northeast of the Rincon Mountains. It was not a large town. It had a general store, a post office that shared a building with the barber, a livery stable run by a Mexican man named Esteban who was the most competent person Owen would meet there, a saloon called the Copper Bell, a church with a leaning steeple, and perhaps 40 residents scattered across the valley on properties of varying sizes. The town had grown up around the water, as all desert towns did, and it carried that quality of places that existed because they had to rather than because anyone had chosen them with particular joy. Susan Fairchild's property was 2 miles south of the town center, down a packed earth road that ran alongside an irrigation ditch that had gone dry. Owen found it in the late afternoon of his second day riding from Tucson, the light going gold and long across the desert scrub, the saguaros casting their ridiculous shadows across the flats. The house was adobe, single-story, with a covered porch running along the front and a kitchen garden on the eastern side that had been recently and energetically weeded. There was a barn in better repair than the house, and a small corral where 3 horses stood in the early evening calm. A clothesline stretched between 2 mesquite posts held a row of clean laundry, moving gently in the warm wind. Owen pulled his horse, a patient bay gelding he called Sergeant, to a stop in the yard and looked at the house for a moment. He noticed the window shutters needed repainting. He noticed the hinge on the gate to the kitchen garden was broken, and the gate was propped against the fence post instead of hung properly. He noticed the irrigation ditch that came down from the north had a break in it about 30 yards up from the house where someone had clearly tried and failed to make a repair with packed mud that had since crumbled. He had not finished cataloging what he saw when the front door opened, and a woman came onto the porch. Susan Fairchild was 26 years old, and Owen found out later that people in Harlow Creek described her as pretty in the way they might describe a practical object as having good lines, meaning they acknowledged it as fact without attaching any particular sentiment to the acknowledgement. What Owen saw when she stepped onto the porch was a woman of medium height with dark brown hair pulled back under a practical hat, wearing a work dress that had seen better days and boots that suggested she spent most of her time outdoors. Her face was brown from the sun, and her eyes were dark and watchful, and not particularly welcoming. She stood with her arms loose at her sides and her chin level, and she looked at him the way a woman alone looks at an unfamiliar man arriving at her door in the late afternoon, which is to say with careful attention and without warmth. "You are on my property," she said, "not hostile, informational." "Yes, ma'am," Owen said. He took off his hat. "My name is Owen Ramsey. I was sent here by a man named Clifford Purcell. He wanted me to come and see if I could be of any help to you." Something moved across her face. It was not joy and it was not grief, but something in between, the expression of a person who has been expecting news and is relieved it is not worse than it might have been. "Clifford is alive then," she said. "He was when I left him, both legs broken and his ribs cracked up, but the doctor in Tucson said he will mend if he takes the time for it." She was quiet for a moment. "He would not take the time for it," she said, and something in her voice told Owen she knew Clifford Purcell well enough to know exactly what kind of man he was. Then she looked at Owen steadily. "You pulled him out of that wagon?" "Yes, ma'am." "And then he sent you here?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did he tell you why?" Owen hesitated. He did not want to alarm her by listing off what Clifford had said about trouble coming. "He said you were alone and that there was more work here than one person could manage." She regarded him with those dark, watchful eyes for a long moment. The evening light was shifting, and a quail called somewhere in the brush beyond the corral. Then she came down the 2 steps from the porch and walked toward him with her hand extended, and Owen got down from sergeant to shake it, and her grip was firm and dry and businesslike. "Susan Fairchild," she said. "My husband was Thomas Fairchild. He and Clifford ran cattle together for 7 years, until Thomas died in February. The cattle are mostly gone now, and the money is mostly gone, and the property has more problems than I have been able to address alone. I have not been asking for help because I do not particularly like asking, but if Clifford sent you then, I am prepared to accept you." "That is very generous of you," Owen said, meaning it. She looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she was deciding whether he was making fun of her. Then she seemed to decide he was not. "You can put your horse in the corral. There is a sleeping room in the barn. I will have supper ready in an hour." She turned and went back up the steps and into the house without another word, and Owen stood in the yard for a moment with his hat in his hand and the warm desert evening settling around him. He looked at the broken gate hinge and the dry irrigation ditch and the faded shutters. He put his hat back on and led Sergeant toward the corral. He told himself he would stay a week, maybe 2. Long enough to fix the gate and the irrigation ditch, and whatever else needed doing that a single woman could not reasonably accomplish alone. He would do that much for Clifford, who had no one else to send, and then he would move on the way he always moved on. He had no reason to suspect that 2 weeks would become a month, or that a month would become the winter, or that by the time the spring rains came he would have stopped counting entirely. Supper that first evening was beans and salt pork and cornbread and a pot of very strong coffee, and they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the desert dark pressing against the windows. Susan was not a talkative woman at the table, but she was not unfriendly either, and she answered his questions about the property with a directness and clarity that he found himself respecting more with each passing minute. She knew exactly what she had and what it was worth and what it needed. She had not inherited her husband's cattle operation so much as survived its collapse, and she was now engaged in the project of turning what remained of the land into something that could sustain her independently. "I'm not trying to recreate what Thomas had," she told him, pushing the last of her beans around the plate. "The cattle business here is too dependent on water we do not reliably have, and on grazing land that the larger outfits are slowly acquiring. What I want is to grow things. Fruit trees and vegetables and some chickens and perhaps eventually some bee colonies. Thomas always thought it was too small a vision. "What do you think?" Owen asked. "I think that a small, reliable thing is worth considerably more than a large, uncertain one," she said. He had nothing to argue with in that. After supper, he went out to the barn and lay down on the narrow cot in the small room at the back that smelled of hay and old leather, and he stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the horses moving in the corral and the far-off call of a coyote, and he thought about what Clifford had said about trouble coming. He had not pressed Clifford on what kind of trouble, and now he wished he had. In the morning, he decided, he would ask Susan directly. He asked her the next morning while they stood together looking at the broken section of irrigation ditch in the early light, the air still cool and smelling of sage, the sky going from orange to the particular pale blue of the Arizona Territory desert. She was carrying a coffee mug in both hands and her hair was loose in a braid down her back, and she looked younger than she had the evening before, which he found disorienting. "Clifford mentioned there might be trouble," he said carefully. "He did not say what kind." She drank her coffee and considered the broken ditch. "There is a man named Gerald Norris," she said. "He has a large cattle operation 4 miles north. He has been buying or otherwise acquiring properties in this valley for the past 3 years. He offered Thomas a price for this land twice, and Thomas refused twice, and then Thomas died, and Gerald Norris came to see me 6 weeks later and offered me half of what he had offered Thomas." Owen was quiet, waiting. "I told him no," Susan said. "He came back 2 weeks after that with a different face on, more sympathetic, talking about how difficult it must be to manage alone, and how he only wanted to help me avoid a worse situation. I told him no again. Since then there have been small things. One of my horses was let out of the corral in the night, and I found it 2 miles away in the morning. My irrigation water has been interrupted twice, once by a rock fall that may have been natural, and once by what appeared to be deliberate blockage upstream. A man came and told me my land documents were not properly filed with the territory office and that there might be a dispute over the boundaries, which I investigated and found to be entirely false. He is trying to wear you down," Owen said. "Yes," Susan said simply. "He is trying to wear me down." Owen looked at the broken section of ditch. "Then we should fix this first," he said, "and make sure it stays fixed." She looked at him then sideways with an expression he could not quite read. "We," she said. "It is what I was sent here for," he said. She looked back at the ditch. "All right then," she said. "The tools are in the barn." They worked on the irrigation ditch all morning, Owen digging and packing and lining the broken section with flat stones to prevent future erosion while Susan ferried stones from the dry creek bed 50 yards away in a wheelbarrow. It was hard, sweating work, and they did not talk much while they did it, but there was a comfortable quality to the silence that Owen noticed and did not examine. She worked without complaint and without drama, and she was strong and practical about it, in a way that made him think she had been doing heavy work alone for long enough that she had stopped noticing it was heavy. By midday, they had the ditch repaired, and the water running again from the upstream line, and Susan stood at the edge of the garden and watched the water move down the channel toward her vegetable beds, with an expression on her face that was the closest thing to happiness Owen had seen from her yet. "Good," she said quietly, to herself more than to him. In the afternoon, he fixed the gate hinge and rehung the kitchen garden gate properly, and he found a section of the corral fence that had come loose and repaired it, and he replaced a broken board on the porch step that he had nearly put his boot through that morning. When the light went low, he washed at the pump in the yard and went to sit on the porch step while Susan cooked supper, and the evening came down warm and heavy, and the stars began to show over the eastern ridge, and Owen Ramsey felt something in him go very quiet. It was not a feeling he was familiar with. The nearest thing to it he could remember was a night many years ago when he had been riding alone across the high desert, and had stopped to camp at the edge of a mesa, and had looked out at the country falling away below him for 100 miles, and had felt for one astonishing moment like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had not stayed on that mesa. He had never stayed anywhere. But the feeling came back to him now, sitting on Susan Fairchild's porch step with the sound of her moving in the kitchen behind him, and the desert going dark and sweet around him. He dismissed it as tiredness and went in for supper. Over the next 2 weeks, he worked his way through every visible repair the property needed. He rebuilt the section of roof over the back bedroom that had been letting in rain. He cleared the brush from around the house walls to reduce fire risk and the likelihood of snakes taking up residence in the foundation gaps. He repaired the barn door latch and the paddock gate and the broken runner on the chicken coop that had been allowing something to get under it at night. He planted the second row of fruit tree saplings that Susan had purchased and been unable to get in the ground alone, 6 young apple trees and 4 peach trees along the southern fence line, where the sun would reach them most of the day. Susan watched him plant the last peach tree and came and stood beside him in the dirt with her arms crossed and her head tilted and said, "Thomas always said fruit trees were too slow an investment, that you had to wait too many years before they gave anything back." "That is true," Owen said. He tamped the soil around the base of the sapling. "But once they are bearing, you do not have to replant them." "That was my argument also," she said, and there was a quiet satisfaction in her voice. He looked up at her. She was looking at the little row of saplings with an expression that had something tender in it, something that lived below her usual reserve. And he had the sudden clear sense of a woman who had been told too many times that her ideas were too small or too slow or not worth the investment, and who had simply kept the ideas alive privately and planted them in the ground anyway the first moment she had the chance. He looked away before she could catch him looking. Gerald Norris arrived on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October on a black horse that was worth considerably more than anything else in Harlow Creek, accompanied by 2 men who sat back 20 feet from him, with that particular relaxed alertness of hired hands who are there to look like hired hands and are in fact something else. Norris himself was in his mid-40s, with a broad face and the look of a man who had been physically imposing in his youth and had since converted the musculature into authority. He wore a good hat and good boots, and he had the smile of a man who had been told many times that he was charming. Owen was on the roof of the barn replacing 3 warped shingles when the riders came into the yard. He did not come down immediately. He stayed where he was and watched from the height. Susan came out of the house onto the porch. She stood with her arms loose and her chin up, and even from the roof Owen could see the set of her shoulders. "Mrs. Fairchild," Norris said, touching his hat brim, "you are looking well." "Mr. Norris," she said, neutral, giving nothing. "I heard you had taken on some hired help," he said, and his eyes moved across the yard and found Owen on the barn roof. "I have," Susan said. "Glad to hear it. A place like this needs looking after." He let his eyes travel across the yard and the house with the proprietary appraisal of a man who was already thinking of it as his. "I came to extend the offer again, Susan. I know the last figure I mentioned was perhaps not. The answer is still no, Mr. Norris," Susan said. Norris smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who was accustomed to waiting for other people to become desperate enough to say yes. "Property taxes in this territory are not insignificant," he said. "And a woman alone." "I am not alone," Susan said, and her voice did not change pitch or volume, but something in it shifted, something that was very clear and very settled. "And the property taxes are current and will continue to be current. I thank you for your concern about my situation, and I am telling you directly that I do not wish to sell this land, and I do not anticipate that position changing. Good afternoon." Norris looked at her for a moment with the patient smile still on his face, and then his eyes went back up to Owen on the barn roof, and Owen looked back at him with nothing in his face at all, which he had found over the years was more effective than looking threatening. Norris touched his hat brim again and wheeled his horse and rode back out with his 2 men following. Owen finished with the shingles and came down the ladder. Susan was still on the porch and she was gripping the porch rail with both hands, and when he got close enough he could see that her knuckles were white. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, after a moment, he has been doing this since February, 8 months. I thought if I held long enough he would find a different property to want. Men like that are particular about what they want, Owen said. It is not really about the land. She looked at him. What is it about then? It is about the no, he said. Some men are bothered by it past all rational measure. She considered this. Her grip on the rail relaxed. What do you suggest? I suggest we get the title documents properly in order and make sure the water rights are registered correctly. If he is going to make another move, it will likely be through something legal or quasi-legal, and the best defense against that is having every paper right and every filing current. I do not have a lawyer, she said. Clifford will know one in Tucson, Owen said. I will write him a letter. She looked at him with that sideways appraising look she had given him on the first morning, the one that seemed to be quietly recalibrating something. All right, she said. Then quietly, thank you, Owen. It was the first time she had used his first name, and he felt it somewhere unreasonable, the way you feel a sudden change in the temperature of the air. He wrote to Clifford that evening at the kitchen table while Susan worked on her account ledger across from him, and the lamp made a warm circle of light around both of them, and the desert was quiet outside, and there was no good reason for him to notice how the lamp light fell on her hair, except that he was noticing it anyway, which he filed away under the general category of observations he was not going to act on. October deepened and the desert heat broke properly, and the mornings turned cool enough for a coat, and the light went longer and more golden across the valley. Clifford wrote back with the name of a lawyer in Tucson named Emmett Howarth, a man he vouched for thoroughly, and Owen sent Susan's documents to Emmett Howarth by the mail rider and waited for word back. In the meantime, the property continued to give them work to do. Owen hired a man from town named Dackery, a freedman who had come west from Georgia after the war and had been doing day labor in the valley for 2 years, to help him re-dig and level the full length of the irrigation channel, which had been losing water to seepage along most of its length and needed proper stone lining throughout. Dackery was a big, quietly competent man who knew more about irrigation than Owen did, and who worked without stopping and without complaint, and who brought his own food in a cloth sack because he had learned not to rely on other people's kitchens. On the third day of that work, Susan brought lunch out to both of them, setting it on a flat rock near where they were working, and she included enough for Dackery without having to be asked, which was the kind of thing Owen noticed about her. The way she did not treat Dackery as an afterthought or a complication. The way she filled his plate the same as she filled Owen's and said, "I hope the cornbread is still warm," with the same tone she used for everyone. Dackery noticed it too. On the way back to work he said to Owen quietly, "She is a good woman, this one." Owen said, "Yes," with more certainty than he had intended. Dackery glanced at him with the knowing look of a man who had been alive long enough to recognize certain tones of voice, and he said nothing else, which Owen was grateful for. The lawyer Emmett Howarth sent word in late October that the title documents were in order, but that Susan's water rights registration had a deficiency, a clerical error from an original filing 7 years prior that had never been corrected. It was the kind of deficiency that would not matter unless someone with resources and intention decided to make it matter, and both Owen and Susan understood without having to say. It allowed that someone with resources and intention was in the process of deciding exactly that. "We need to go to Tucson," Owen said, reading the lawyer's letter at the kitchen table. "Both of us," Susan asked. "You need to sign the corrected filing personally." The lawyer said as much. He looked up. "It is a 2-day ride. We could leave Monday and return Wednesday." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking about the house, about the horses, about the logistics of being away. "Dackery could look in on the horses," she said, almost to herself. "He offered to yesterday," Owen said. "I think he anticipated this." She looked at him with a quick flash of something that might have been amusement. "You two have been discussing my business without me." "We discussed the irrigation water, which is technically your business," he said, keeping his face entirely neutral. She pressed her lips together to suppress something that was definitely a smile and looked back at the letter. "Monday," she said. "All right." They rode to Tucson on Monday under a sky that was all high blue and the morning air cold enough to see their breath. They took Sergeant and Susan's best horse, a gray mare named Callie who was steady and good-tempered, and they rode south out of the valley and into the wider desert flats where the saguaros stood in their thousands against the pale hills. Susan rode well, sitting easy in the saddle the way someone does who grew up riding rather than learned it as adults. She wore a divided skirt for riding and her coat and her hat pulled low, and she looked out at the country with the expression of someone who was accustomed to it and loved it anyway. They talked as they rode, which was different from the conversations they had at the house. At the house, the conversations were about the property, about tasks and plans and practicalities. Out on the open road, with the country running away on all sides, the conversations widened. He told her about growing up in New Mexico territory, about his father who had been a blacksmith and his mother who had been a school teacher, and who had died when Owen was 12, which had unmoored his father to the point where he had sold the smithy and begun to drift, and Owen had drifted with him and eventually drifted past him. She told him about growing up in Kansas, the flat immensity of it, the way the sky was all there was for entertainment, and how she had married Thomas Fairchild at 22 and come south to Arizona with him because he was optimistic and full of plans, and she had believed in his optimism enough to follow it. "Were you happy?" Owen asked, and then felt the question was too personal and started to revise it, but she answered it before he could. "For a while," she said. "Thomas was a good man and he worked hard and he was kind. But his vision was always bigger than his means, and I spent a great deal of our marriage in the gap between those two things, trying to hold the practical things together while he aimed for the large ones." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not say that against him. I think he believed the large thing was always about to come. He just did not live to find out if it would." "I am sorry," Owen said. "So am I," she said simply, and they rode on in a silence that was not uncomfortable. They stopped at midday in the shade of a stand of palo verde trees by a rocky wash where there was water enough for the horses, and Susan unpacked the lunch she had prepared, bread and dried beef and hard-boiled eggs, and 2 oranges that she had bought from the general store and held back for the trip. They sat on a flat rock and ate, and the desert was absolutely quiet around them except for the horses drinking and the small sounds of the dry country. "Do you always move like this?" Susan asked. "From place to place." "Yes," Owen said. "Do you prefer it?" He thought about that for a moment. "I thought I did," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that went on slightly longer than a moment ought to. "This orange is very good," he said finally, looking down at it. "I know," she said, and he was almost certain she was making fun of him. They reached Tucson in the late afternoon of the second day and took rooms at a boarding house near the center of town, 2 separate rooms on the same floor, and met Emmett Howarth the next morning in his office, which was a narrow room above a hardware store on Congress Street. Howarth was a small, precise man in his 50s with reading glasses and a meticulous manner, and he went through Susan's documents with the focused care of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and what was trying to be done with it. The corrected water rights filing took most of the morning, with 3 separate documents to be signed and witnessed and filed with the territorial office, which required walking 2 blocks to a government building where a man behind a counter received the documents with the particular lack of enthusiasm of a government employee in the middle of the day. But it was done, and it was dated, and it was official, and when Susan walked back out of that building into the bright Tucson afternoon, she had a copy of the corrected filing in her hand and her chin was up, and she looked like someone who had just won a fight. That should discourage him, Howarth had told them before they left his office. Not forever, perhaps. Men like Norris have more patience than they have conscience. But it takes away the easiest route, and most men will look for easier ground before they do something more direct. Owen hoped that was true and made a mental note to keep watching. They had the afternoon free in Tucson before the ride back began the following morning, and they spent it in the way of people who find themselves unexpectedly at leisure. They walked the length of Congress Street, looking in shop windows. Owen bought a new pair of work gloves, and Susan bought a small packet of flower seeds she had been wanting, marigolds and zinnias, and they stopped at a small restaurant that served Mexican food and had a meal that was nothing like what either of them ate at the property. And Susan closed her eyes when she tasted the green chili and said, "I have not been to a restaurant in 2 years," in a tone that made Owen want to bring her to 100 of them. "That is too long," he said. "Yes, well," she said, "the ranch does not run itself. You could go to Harlow Creek for meals sometimes. The general store has hardtack and dried apples," she said dryly. "Very luxurious." He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed properly since arriving at the property, not the brief acknowledgments of things that were mildly funny but a real laugh. And Susan looked at him with a slightly startled expression, and then smiled, a real smile, the first full one he had seen from her, and it altered her whole face in a way that made something in his chest do something impractical. They rode back to Harlow Creek the next day, and arrived in the late afternoon to find Dacquiri in the yard feeding the horses and everything exactly as they had left it, which was a relief, and also slightly disappointing in the way that you feel when you realize that a place was getting along just fine without your presence. The weeks after Tucson had a different quality. He could not exactly have said what changed, only that something had. There was an ease between them that had not been there before, a comfort born of the 2 days on the road together, and the hours in Howarth's office, and the meal in the restaurant with the green chili. They still spent most of their time on the practical business of the property, because the property had not stopped needing work, but now the work had a quality of collaboration that felt less like an employee arrangement and more like a partnership. He noticed small things about her that he had not had room to notice before. The way she woke early and came out to sit on the porch with her first coffee before the sun was fully up, and the look on her face in those minutes was the most unguarded he ever saw her. The way she talked to the horses with a warm, conversational tone, as though they were people she liked. The way she had filled the windowsills of the house with small things she found interesting. A red rock shaped like an arrowhead, a piece of wood worn smooth by water, a dried flower that had been pressed in a book and had kept its color. He noticed the way she looked at her little fruit tree saplings each morning, the way other people looked at children, quickly and with a checking quality, making sure they had made it through the night. He noticed that she laughed more than he had initially thought she did. That the laugh was quick and quiet, and that she often seemed slightly surprised by it, as though she had not expected to find something funny and was a little pleased that she had. He began to sit on the porch in the evenings after supper instead of going directly to the barn, and she began to bring her coffee out to the porch in those evenings instead of doing the accounts, and they sat in the warm dark and talked or were quiet by turns, and the desert turned cold overhead, and the stars were outrageous in their brightness this far from any town lights, and Owen felt the deep, wordless rightness of those evenings in a way he could not account for and did not try to. He did not know how to name what he was feeling. He had been in the vicinity of women before, had even thought he was in love twice in his 20s, and had been wrong both times in ways that instructed him, but this was different in a way that was hard to articulate. It was not the fierce forward pull of infatuation, though there was certainly an element of wanting in it. It was more like something structural, something load-bearing, like discovering that a wall you had been leaning against for a while was not just a wall but a foundation. He told himself it was not something to act on. She was still in the first year of her widowhood, or close to it. She was in a difficult situation with Norris and the property, and the last thing she needed was her hired hand developing inconvenient feelings. He was also, as he reminded himself, not the kind of man who stayed. He had no practice at it. He would fix what needed fixing and then he would go, and she would find a proper arrangement, perhaps a farmhand who wanted to stay on long term, and she would manage the way she was clearly capable of managing. He told himself this with considerable conviction, and then went and sat on the porch in the evening anyway. November brought the cold nights of the desert autumn and the first killing frosts that came in the small hours, and turned the last of the summer garden to limp brown. And Susan and Owen worked together pulling the dead plants and turning the soil under and planting the winter things, the cold hardy greens and the root vegetables that would come up in the mild Arizona winter. Daiquiri came 3 days a week now, regularly, and the three of them had worked out an easy rhythm of it that made the heavy things light. It was Daiquiri who first said anything about Owen staying. He said it one afternoon when they were building a low wall along the north side of the garden to block the prevailing winter wind from the tender seedlings, working with the flat stones from the creek bed, fitting them together without mortar in the old style. "You planning to be here for the spring planting?" Daiquiri asked, not looking up from the stones. Owen did not answer immediately. "Because if you are," Daiquiri continued, still fitting stones, "the winter is the right time to dig the second irrigation branch down to the lower pasture. Save you doing it when the ground is hard." "That is a practical observation," Owen said. "I am a practical man," Daiquiri said. They worked in silence for a moment. "I had not decided about the spring," Owen said. Daiquiri placed a stone with care. "Some things get decided for a man," he said, "before he gets around to deciding them himself." Owen had nothing to say to that, which Daiquiri seemed to find entirely satisfactory. That evening after supper, Susan spread a hand-drawn map of the property on the kitchen table and showed Owen what she was thinking about for the following year. She wanted to expand the kitchen garden by a third, adding a proper root cellar for storage. She wanted to build a small chicken house more substantial than the current coop, enough for 20 birds, which would give eggs to sell in town as well as to eat. She wanted to sink a second well closer to the barn, because the single pump in the yard required her to carry water farther than was sensible for daily chores. She had been thinking about a small greenhouse structure against the south wall of the house, for starting seedlings in late winter, and perhaps growing some things through the summer that normally could not survive the heat without protection. She laid it out with a quiet focus, pointing to each thing on the map, and Owen leaned over the table beside her, following her finger and asking questions about the root cellar dimensions and the well depth and the greenhouse framing. And at some point he realized they were standing very close together, the map between them on the table and their shoulders almost touching, and he became extremely aware of this fact at the same moment she seemed to become aware of it also. She did not move away. He did not move away. They both looked at the map. "The root cellar will need to go at least 8 feet down to get below the frost line," he said, his voice sounding completely normal, which he found impressive. "Yes," she said, also completely normal. "I could start on that in January when the ground is soft from the winter wet." "That would be good," she said. They continued looking at the map. Then she said, "Will you be here in January?" It was a practical question, the same kind she asked about everything, but it landed differently. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I will," he said. She did not look up from the map. "Good," she said, in a tone that was trying to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. He went to bed that night in the barn room and lay on the cot with his arms behind his head and stared at the darkness and thought that he was in significant trouble. December came, and with it, the cooler, dry days that the desert generously offers as a kind of recompense for the murderous summers, and the valley was beautiful in December, the light flat and bright on the pale hills, the evenings going blue and cold, and the stars coming out hard and clear. They had established a rhythm that felt completely natural and would have seemed, to anyone watching, like the rhythm of people who had been living and working together for years rather than months. Mornings, Susan on the porch with her coffee and Owen at the pump washing before coming to the kitchen where she would have the stove going and breakfast ready, and they would eat together and talk about the day's work. Days. Work. Variable but constant, the property always providing something to address, supplemented 3 days a week by Dacquiri, who had become indispensable, and who was saving the wages Owen was paying him carefully with some long-term plan he kept private. Evenings, supper, and then the porch, always the porch, the two of them in their chairs with the cold night and the stars and the occasional distant call of a coyote. On the first properly cold night in December, Owen brought the little outdoor chairs into the covered part of the porch, and Susan disappeared inside and came back with a wool blanket that she handed to him without comment, and then sat down with her own blanket pulled around her shoulders, and they sat in the winter dark, both wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee. "My mother had a saying," Susan said, "that the nights a woman sits on her own porch in the cold are the nights she is most certain of herself." Was she a woman who was often uncertain? Owen asked. "She was a woman who had to work very hard to appear certain when she was not," Susan said. "She thought it was important that I see the effort involved." Owen thought about that. "That sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Susan said, and her voice was warm with it, the warmth of someone speaking of someone well-loved who is no longer present. They were quiet for a while. A meteor went over, bright and quick. "Owen," Susan said, and the way she said it made him look at her. "Yes," he said. "I want to thank you for what you have done here, not just the work. I want to thank you for staying. I know you are not the kind of man who stays in one place. Clifford told me as much in his letters." Owen went very still. "Clifford wrote to you about me?" "Several times. He said he was not sure you would come at all, and then when you did come he was not sure you would stay more than a week. He said," she paused, and in the darkness he could see her looking at her coffee mug. "He said that he had never met a man with more talent for making himself comfortable in solitude and less talent for recognizing when he did not need it." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "Clifford talks more than a man with broken ribs ought to," he said finally. She laughed, that quick, quiet laugh. "He does," she agreed. Then more carefully, "I am just glad you stayed, whatever the reason." "I stayed because there was work to do," he said. And even as he said it, he knew it was not the whole truth, and he suspected she knew it was not the whole truth, and he suspected she was going to let him have it anyway because she was that kind of person. "Of course," she said pleasantly. He looked at her. In the cold dark her face was composed and gentle, and her eyes were bright. He thought about Dacquiri's comment about things getting decided for a man before he got around to deciding them himself, and he thought about the moment he had looked up at Susan Fairchild from the broken irrigation ditch on the first morning and felt some click of rightness that he had been trying to not examine ever since. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said, and something in her tone told him she was waiting. "I have been telling myself for 3 months that I was going to leave," he said. "Not imminently, but eventually, as soon as the important work was done. I have been telling myself that because it is what I do, and it is what I know how to do, and also because I did not think it was my place to." He stopped. He was not a man who found words for things easily. "I do not think I can leave," he said. "I am not sure I could now, even if I wanted to, which I find I do not. And I wanted to say that plainly rather than going on pretending it was only about the work." She was quiet for a moment that felt like a long time and probably was not. "I am glad you said that plainly," she said. Her voice was steady and very careful, and he could hear that she was managing something under the carefulness. "Because I have been sitting on this porch for 2 months hoping you would say something like it and telling myself I was being foolish." He looked at her. She was looking back at him. "You were not being foolish," he said. "No," she agreed. "I was not." He reached across the space between the two chairs and found her hand where it was wrapped in the blanket and held it. And she turned her hand and held his back. And they sat that way for a long time in the cold December night with the stars wheeling overhead and the coyote calling again somewhere distant in the dark. And it was the simplest and most complete thing Owen Ramsey had felt in his life. In the morning nothing was dramatically different and everything was dramatically different. Breakfast was the same. The work was the same. But the quality of the space between them had shifted. had lost the careful neutral quality it had maintained for 3 months and gained something warmer and more direct. He found reasons to be near her. She did not create distance when he was near. When they passed in the kitchen, she did not step sideways the way she had before. Small things, but in the vocabulary of two reserved people they were loud. He kissed her for the first time 10 days later, on the porch in the late evening, standing up to go in for the night, and turning to find her standing at the porch rail looking at him with an expression that was completely unambiguous. He crossed the distance between them, and she turned toward him, and it was quiet and unhurried and very certain, the way things are when they are not happening for the first time in spirit, even if they are in fact. She pulled back and looked at him with her hand on his chest and said, "I was beginning to think you were going to wait until spring." "I was not going to wait until spring," he said. "Good," she said, and the smile she gave him then was different from any smile he had seen from her before, wide open and without the usual reserve, and it was a smile he wanted to cause as many times as possible for the rest of his life. Christmas was quiet and their own. Dacquiri came in the morning to check on the horses, and Susan had made a small Christmas cake with the dried fruit she had been saving, and the three of them shared it in the kitchen with coffee. And it was, Owen thought, one of the nicest Christmases he had experienced, which admittedly was not a high bar given his itinerant history, but which felt true anyway. He wrote a letter to Clifford that Christmas afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with Susan reading at the other end. He told Clifford that the water rights were filed, that the property was in good shape, that Norris had been quiet since the Tucson trip. He told Clifford at the end that he thought he understood now why Clifford had sent him, and that he was grateful for it. Clifford's return letter arrived in mid-January, and Susan read it first, which she did not explain but which Owen found he did not mind, and then she handed it to him across the table, and he read it, and the last paragraph said, "I always thought Thomas was a fool for not seeing what he had. I hope Owen is not that kind of fool. I suspect he is not, given that he is still there. Give him my regards." Owen put the letter down on the table. "Clifford is insufferable," he said. "He is," Susan agreed warmly. In January they dug the root cellar, Owen and Dacquiri working in shifts with pickaxes and shovels in the damp winter ground, 8 feet down and 6 feet square, lined with flat stones and fitted with a heavy wooden door. Susan engineered the stone lining herself, sketching it out first on paper and directing the placement of each course, so the walls would not shift with the seasonal changes in the ground. She knew more about masonry than either of the men, and she was not shy about it, and Dacquiri and Owen both deferred to her instructions without drama, and the result was a root cellar that was solid and well-made, and which Susan walked into on the day it was finished and stood in the center of for a moment with her eyes closed, and then came out and said, "That is exactly right," with a profound contentment. Gerald Norris made his next move in February, and it was more aggressive than what had come before. Owen was in the barn when Dacquiri came in fast from the road and said that 2 men from Norris's operation had ridden onto the property in the morning, while Owen was in town at the post office, and had told Susan that Norris was filing a legal complaint about the road access through the southwest corner of her land, claiming it was a shared easement that she was improperly restricting. Susan had told them she had no record of any shared easement and that they should speak with her lawyer. They had left, but not before one of them had said, in a tone that made it a suggestion rather than a statement, that it was a lot of land for one woman to be managing. Owen went to the house and found Susan at the kitchen table with her land documents spread out in front of her, looking through them with the focused intensity of someone who knows exactly where the problem is and is determined to find it before someone else does. "Is there an easement?" he asked, sitting across from her. "There should not be. Thomas never mentioned one and I have no record of one, but I want to be sure before I respond formally." She turned a page. "The original land grant from 1873 does not mention it. The subsequent survey from 1877 does not mention it." She turned another page. If Norris has a document claiming it exists, it was created after 1877, and I would like to see it before any legal proceeding." She sent a letter to Emmett Howarth in Tucson that afternoon, and Howarth replied within the week. Norris had indeed filed a complaint, citing a handwritten agreement supposedly made between his predecessor in title and the previous owner of Susan's property, a man who had died intestate in 1870, and from whom the property had passed through two hands before Thomas Fairchild purchased it. The agreement, if it existed and was valid, would predate Susan's title entirely. "It may be genuine," Howarth wrote, "or it may not be. These old handwritten arrangements were common, and their legal standing is uncertain. I recommend we challenge it as unverifiable." It took 6 weeks and cost Susan more than she had intended to spend, but in early March the territorial court examiner in Tucson found the claimed easement agreement insufficient to establish legal right and dismissed the complaint. Owen was in the room when Susan read the letter from Howarth, and she read it once and then set it on the table and put her face in her hands for a moment, and when she took her hands away her eyes were bright. "It is done," she said. "For now," Owen said carefully. She looked at him. "You think he will try again?" "I think men like Norris do not stop because they lost a legal proceeding. They stop when the calculation changes for them." What would change the calculation? Owen had been thinking about this. "Visibility," he said. "Right now he treats you as an isolated target. If the valley knew clearly that the Fairchild property was well established, well staffed, legally secured, and not going anywhere, the calculation changes. It costs him more in reputation to keep pressing than it would if people do not know what he is doing." She thought about this. "The town does not pay much attention to what happens out here." "I know. But a town pays attention to what its merchants and its church and its post office know about. If your products were moving through the town regularly, if you were a visible and established part of the valley economy, it would be different." She looked at him with those dark, serious eyes. "You are talking about the chickens and the eggs." "I am talking about the chickens and the eggs and the fruit trees when they bear and the root vegetables and whatever else this property produces. You should be selling in Harlow Creek. You should be known there not as Thomas Fairchild's widow, but as Susan Fairchild, who provides the best eggs in the valley." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her turning it over, testing it. "It is what I wanted anyway," she said at last. "I just had not thought of it as a defensive strategy." "Useful things often are more than one thing at once," he said. By April, the new chicken house was built and occupied by 18 hens and 2 roosters, and Susan was delivering eggs to the general store in Harlow Creek twice a week. She began selling excess vegetables as well, and word spread through the valley in the way that word spreads in small places, quietly and thoroughly, until Susan Fairchild was a known quantity in Harlow Creek in a way she had not been when she was only Thomas Fairchild's widow, managing the property alone. Norris made no further moves that spring. Owen did not believe this represented a genuine retreat so much as a recalculation, but the quiet was welcome regardless. The spring was the most beautiful Owen had seen in Arizona territory, which he thought might have something to do with the fact that he had never seen it from a fixed point before, never been in one place long enough to watch a single landscape go from the spare gray-green of winter through the wild flowering of the desert in April, the ocotillo red and the palo verde yellow, and the saguaro beginning its slow bloom, and the new leaves coming on Susan's young fruit trees. The apple trees showing the first suggestion of blossoms, small and white and extraordinary. She was standing at the garden fence looking at the apple blossoms when he came up beside her one morning in late April, and she did not say anything for a moment, and neither did he. "Thomas said it would be 3 years before they bloomed," she said at last. "He was wrong," Owen said. She smiled. "He was often wrong about things he thought were too slow," she said. She reached out and very lightly touched one of the small blossoms with her fingertip, the way you touch something you were afraid might not be real. "I want to plant more of them," she said, "along the whole south fence. and I want to build a proper fruit cellar for storage when they are bearing properly. We can do that this fall, he said. We, she said, and she glanced at him sideways, and the word between them had a specific gravity that it had earned over the months. Yes, he said, we. She looked at him with clear dark eyes. Owen, she said, are you going to ask me to marry you, or do I have to ask you? He stared at her. She looked perfectly composed, as though she had just asked him a practical question about the irrigation schedule. He began. Because I am 37 days away from having been widowed exactly 1 year, she said, which I understand is the conventional minimum, and if you were planning to ask, I thought I should let you know that I would say yes, and also that if you were not planning to ask, I am perfectly capable of asking myself. He looked at her for a moment in the April morning with the blossoming apple trees behind her, and the desert spread out below the property in its improbable spring beauty. And he thought about the scrap of paper and the dying man's wish, and the broken irrigation ditch, and the long evenings on the porch, and the December night when she had taken his hand through the blanket. I was planning to ask, he said. I had been planning to ask for some time. I was waiting for the year to pass. I know, she said. I could tell. She tilted her head. You can ask now if you like. I will not hold the timing against you. He took her hands, both of them, right there by the fence with the apple blossoms and the morning sun and the whole long valley below them. Susan Fairchild, he said, I came here because a man on a table with broken legs told me to. I stayed because the irrigation ditch needed fixing, and then because the roof needed fixing, and then because the water rights needed fixing. That is what I told myself. The truth is that I stayed because I could not leave, and I could not name the moment when leaving became impossible, but I know it was somewhere in the first 2 weeks. Will you marry me? She was looking at him with her eyes full of light. Yes, she said. That is the clearest and most honest proposal I have ever received. Was there another one to compare it to? He asked. Thomas was not very clear, she said dryly, and he laughed and she laughed, there by the fence with the apple blossoms moving in the warm spring air. They were married in the Leaning Steeple Church in Harlow Creek on the first Saturday in June, 1883, on a day that was already hot by 9 in the morning, but that softened the colors of everything rather than washing them out. Susan wore a dress she had made herself from a length of blue fabric she had ordered from Tucson, practical in cut but beautiful in color, and she had wildflowers from the desert in her hair, yellow and orange against the dark. Owen wore his best shirt and his second-best hat, and had shined his boots to a standard they had not seen in several years. Dacquari was there, in the front row, wearing a new hat he had purchased for the occasion with money from the wages he had been saving. He sat very straight and looked very pleased. Esteban from the livery was there, and the women from the general store, and several of the Valley families who had become Susan's customers through the egg deliveries. Even Emmett Howarth had ridden up from Tucson, which nobody had expected, and he sat in the back and wept quietly throughout the service in the way of small, precise men who turn out to be deeply sentimental. Clifford Purcell was not there because he was still in Tucson with his healing legs, but he had sent a letter that the minister read aloud, which said, I sent a drifter to fix a broken gate, and it appears that the gate fixed the drifter. I could not be more pleased. I only wish I could be there to be insufferable about it in person. Susan laughed when the minister read it, and Owen could see her eyes were bright, and he reached over and took her hand, and she held it tightly and did not let go for the rest of the ceremony. The reception was held in the churchyard under the shade of 2 old cottonwoods, with food contributed by several of the valley women, and there was lemonade, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and by mid-afternoon there was music and dancing on the dry grass, and even Dacquari danced, with the woman from the general store who was named Clara and who was apparently an old acquaintance, which was interesting news. Owen danced with Susan twice and stood with her a third time, not dancing but standing at the edge of the churchyard with her hand in his, looking out at the valley going gold in the afternoon, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, and she made a small sound of contentment, and he thought there was probably not a better moment to be had anywhere in Arizona territory at that particular hour. They rode back to the property in the long summer evening, and the house looked different when they rode up to it. The same adobe walls and porch and kitchen garden and the young apple trees along the fence, but the quality of it was different. It was theirs now in a way it had been building toward but not quite reached, and Susan went up the porch steps and paused at the door and looked back at him with a look that was private and full of warmth. "Welcome home," she said. He had not had a home in 20 years, and the word landed with the full weight of what it meant. Not just the house, but the woman and the garden and the apple trees and the root cellar and the 18 hens and the valley below the limestone ridges and the evenings on the porch and all of it. All of it his and him answerable to it, and belonging to it in a way he had not known he needed until he was already in the middle of it. "Thank you," he said, meaning considerably more than the two words could hold. The summer of 1883 was full and good. Owen planted the second set of apple trees along the south fence, 14 of them, young and hopeful in their rows, and Dacari helped him dig the second well near the barn, which took most of July and produced water at 19 feet, clear and cold. Susan expanded the vegetable garden to its full intended size and began selling produce to 2 families in town in addition to the general store, and the chickens were laying more than she could sell, which was a pleasant problem. Gerald Norris came to the property one final time in August, alone, without his 2 men, and he rode into the yard at mid-morning while Owen was mending the fence on the east side and Susan was in the kitchen garden, and he sat on his horse and looked at the property, at the well and the new fence sections and the orchard along the south fence, and his expression was unreadable. Susan came out of the garden and stood at the gate with her hands easy at her sides. "Mrs. Ramsey," Norris said. The new name, acknowledged and used, which told Owen something about the man, that he would note a change in status and adjust to it even when it was not the change he wanted. "Mr. Norris," Susan said. He was quiet for a moment. "This is a fine property," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is. I understand you have been improving it considerably." "We have," she said. Norris looked at Owen, who had set down his fencing tools and was standing by the east fence at an easy distance, looking back at him. Norris looked back at Susan. He seemed to be doing a calculation. The kind of calculation that a man who has been thinking about a property as a target does when he recognizes that the property is no longer a target but a settled and defended thing. "I wanted to offer my congratulations on your marriage," he said, and it was said with a flatness that made it clear it was closing business rather than social grace. "I hope the property continues to do well." "I am sure it will," Susan said pleasantly. Norris touched his hat brim and turned his horse and rode back out, and they watched him go until the dust settled. And then Susan turned back to her garden and Owen turned back to his fencing, and neither of them said much about it, because there was not much to say. Some things ended quietly, and that was fine. Clifford Purcell visited in September, arriving on the male rider's cart because he could not yet ride a horse properly but refusing to wait any longer, his legs still in their healing state but functional enough for slow travel. He was a leaner and somewhat humbler version of himself than Owen had expected, the broken bones having filed off some of his bravado, and he sat at the kitchen table and ate the dinner Susan made for him with the reverence of a man who had been living on boarding house cooking for months. He looked around the kitchen and at the table and at Owen and Susan and said nothing for a while, just looked, and then said, "Well, I will be." "Yes," Owen said. "I sent you to fix a gate," Clifford said. "The gate is fixed," Owen said. "Quite a lot else appears to be fixed as well," Clifford said with deep and obvious satisfaction. Susan put her hand on Clifford's arm across the table. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sending him." Clifford looked at her, and his expression went very gentle for a moment, and Owen understood that Clifford had loved Thomas Fairchild like a brother, and had carried a weight of concern for Susan that had been larger than his broken legs and his cracked ribs. Thomas would have been glad, Clifford said. He would have been glad it was someone decent. He was entirely decent from the first moment, Susan said, and the way she said it made Owen want to look at the wall, which he did. Clifford stayed 3 days and gave unsolicited opinions on the root cellar design and the orchard spacing and the well depth, all of which were correct, and then the mail rider took him back south toward Tucson, and Owen and Susan stood in the yard watching the cart go, and Susan said, "I do like that man immensely," and Owen said, "He is completely insufferable," and they both knew they meant exactly the same thing. The first year of their marriage went the way of good years, which is to say it was full of ordinary things that accumulated into something extraordinary. The root vegetables came up thick and good through the mild winter. The young apple trees put on new growth, and by the second spring showed the promise of what they would eventually be. The chickens expanded to 30, and Susan hired a girl from town named Pillar, who was 16 and clever and good with the birds, to come 3 days a week and help with the chicken house, which freed Susan to spend more time on the accounts and the planning she had always wanted to do. Owen discovered he had a talent for the practical administration of a small farm that he had never had occasion to develop, having spent his life on other people's operations in transient roles. There was a satisfaction in building something you would also be responsible for maintaining, a different quality to the work when the long-term results were yours to live with. He found himself making decisions about the orchard and the well and the irrigation with a long view, thinking in years and seasons rather than days and weeks, and the long view suited him in a way he had not anticipated. He wrote to his father in the spring of 1884 for the first time in 4 years. His father had settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, working as a part-time smithy for a hardware dealer. The letter was brief because Owen had never been good at letters, and his father had never been good at receiving them. But he told his father he had married a good woman and was settled in Arizona Territory, and that the address was enclosed if he wanted to write. His father did write, eventually, a short letter that was awkward and warm in equal measure, and Susan wrote back to his father with far more ease than Owen could have managed, and a correspondence was established that meant something to all 3 of them. In late 1884, Susan told Owen she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the same directness she brought to all important information, and his response was to stand up from the table so fast he knocked over the coffee mug, and then to stand in the middle of the kitchen, not knowing what to do with his hands for about 30 seconds before she laughed, and he pulled her to him, and held her for a long time while the spilled coffee spread across the table, and neither of them moved to address it. The baby was born in May of 1885, a son, born in the bedroom of the adobe house with the midwife from Harlow Creek in attendance and Owen in the hall outside the door, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall for 3 hours, being entirely useless in the physical sense, but present in every other one. When the midwife opened the door and said he could come in, he went in and sat on the edge of the bed, and Susan put the baby in his arms with the matter-of-fact manner of a woman who has just done an enormous thing, and is not inclined to make too much of it. And Owen held his son, and the baby's face was red and squeezed, and completely without interest in Owen at this particular moment. And Owen felt something in him that was too big for the room and probably too big for the territory, and possibly too big for the whole of the southwestern desert. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice that came out considerably more wrecked than he had intended. "He cannot hear you properly yet," Susan said with great gentleness. "I know," Owen said. He looked up at her. She was tired in a deep way he had never seen from her, but she was also luminous with it, lit up from the inside. "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I told you I would be." She had told him many times, patiently and with a slight exasperation, that she was healthy and capable, and that things would proceed normally, and he had known she was right and had worried anyway because that was what loving someone made you do. Now he accepted that she was right with the full relief of having been wrong about needing to worry. They named the baby Thomas Clifford Ramsey, the first name for Susan's first husband whom she had loved and who deserved the remembrance, and the second name for the man whose broken legs had set everything else in motion. When Clifford heard about the middle name, he wrote a letter that was so effusive and pleased that it ran to 4 full pages, which was a record for a man who generally wrote in the most compressed possible terms. Dacquiri, when he heard the name, nodded slowly and said, "Thomas Clifford. That is a good strong name." He was sitting in the kitchen at the time, visiting, and Susan had made coffee and there was cake on the table, and the baby was asleep in the wooden cradle Owen had built in the winter months, and it was the most domestic scene imaginable, and it was real. The valley of Harlow Creek changed over the following years in the way that places in the American West were changing in the 1880s, the wildness contracting and the settled order expanding, more families arriving, the town growing by increments, the church getting its leaning steeple straightened at last. Gerald Norris's large cattle operation diminished as the grazing land it depended on was further divided, and the water became less reliable in dry years, and he sold 2 of his 3 ranches and reduced his presence in the valley to something less aggressive and less visible. He never spoke to Susan again except at a distance and in passing, and Susan did not pursue any further conflict with him, which was the right instinct. Susan's orchard came to its first real bearing in 1886, the apple trees producing enough fruit that she had to acquire a second-hand cider press and begin making preserves and dried fruit to extend the harvest, and the peach trees that followed produced an abundance that she supplied to 3 stores in the valley and to a small operation in Tucson that bottled preserves. The Fairchild Orchard, as people began to call it though she was now Susan Ramsey, became known in the region as producing an unusually sweet apple in a climate where most people assumed apples were not a viable crop. Dacquiri, by this time, had saved enough of his wages to purchase a small piece of land half a mile east of the Ramsey property. He grew mostly vegetables and kept bees, and his honey was sold in Harlow Creek and as far as Tucson. He had married Clara from the general store in the fall of 1884 in a ceremony at the church that half the town attended, and Clara was a force of personality and practical wisdom, who was in some ways the most competent person in Harlow Creek, which was a fact that not all of Harlow Creek was comfortable acknowledging, but which the people who were smart recognized clearly. Susan and Clara became close friends in the way of women who live within a comfortable distance of each other and share a frank and practical outlook on the world, and their friendship deepened both households. Owen and Susan had 2 more children after Thomas, a daughter named Margaret, born in 1887, dark-haired like her mother, and immediately and obviously possessed of her mother's particular quality of quiet determination. And then another son named Henry, born in 1890, who was born curious about everything mechanical and followed his father around the property from the time he could walk, wanting to know how every hinge and pump and fence post worked. Owen watched his children grow the way you watch your apple trees grow when you know you planted them, and you know you will see the full bearing, with a patience that is also a form of joy. He watched Thomas learn to ride at age 4 on a small black horse named Pepper that Susan had selected with care. He watched Margaret read every book in the small collection on the kitchen shelves, and then tell her parents with complete authority that they needed more books, and he arranged to get more books from Tucson. He watched Henry take apart and successfully reassemble a clock at age 6, which Owen had not been entirely sure was possible, and he had quietly put away the pieces of the clock and bought a second one to replace it and said nothing until Henry asked where the old clock had gone, at which point he produced the pieces and said, "You took it apart once. Put it back together." Henry had put it back together in 40 minutes. Clifford Purcell died in the spring of 1888 in Tucson, his legs finally giving out from the compounding complications of the original injuries, plus 6 years of being ignored. He died in the bed of the boarding house he had lived in for years with his doctor and his landlady present, and he left behind him a will that included a small bequest to Susan, enough to plant 12 more apple trees and a note that said, "For the orchard. I always meant to see it properly." Susan planted the 12 trees in the fall of that year, and she named the row Clifford's Row, which was not something she told anyone except Owen, but which she knew and he knew, and that was enough. The year 1890 was the year Owen turned 39 and looked at the property in the clear December light, and tried to reconcile the man he saw in the small mirror in the bedroom, brown and weathered and marked by years of outdoor work, with the man who had ridden into this yard 8 years prior with a scrap of paper in his hand and a horse and a bedroll and not much else. The reconciliation was easy. He was the same man. He was the same man who had pulled Clifford out of the wreckage of a wagon and sat with him through the fever and taken the address and ridden north. He was the man who had fixed the irrigation ditch and planted the apple trees and stood in the December dark and told Susan Fairchild that he could not leave. He was that man still. He was also now Thomas and Margaret and Henry's father. He was Susan's husband. He was the man who knew that the second apple tree from the east end of Clifford's Row produced a slightly different flavor than the others, more tart, and that this was because of the way the ground drained slightly differently in that corner. He was the man who knew which of the 30 hens was the one who consistently escaped from the chicken house, and which direction she went, and which gap in the fence she used to get back. He was the man who knew that when Susan went quiet for an evening she needed the quiet, and when she went quiet for 2 evenings she needed to talk, and the difference was discernible from a slight quality in how she sat. He was the man who had arrived with a horse and a bedroll and been given, by a combination of luck and choice and the particular stubbornness of staying, everything that mattered. He was helping Margaret with her reading one January evening in 1891, the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the book open between them, when Susan came in from the bedroom with a look on her face that was simultaneously very calm and quietly overwhelmed, the look of someone holding a large piece of news gently so as not to drop it. Owen looked up from the book. Susan looked at him. Then she looked at Margaret, who was 7 and was reading with the focused obliviousness of a child engaged in something interesting. "Margaret," Susan said, "go and see if your brothers have brought the eggs in yet." "I think they did," Margaret said, not looking up from the book. "Go and check that they did it properly," Susan said, in the tone that did not invite discussion. Margaret sighed with the profound theatrical exhaustion of a child being interrupted mid-book and went out the back door with a small, unnecessary amount of foot impact on the floor, and Susan sat down at the table across from Owen and looked at him with those clear dark eyes. "Again," Owen said. "It appears so," she said. He leaned across the table and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and she made that small sound of contentment that was, 8 years later, still the most satisfying sound he had ever heard anything make. "Are you glad?" she asked when he pulled back. "Susan," he said, "you could not ask me a question with a more obvious answer," she smiled. "I like to hear it anyway." "Yes," he said, "I am very glad." The 4th child was born in September of 1891, another son, and they named him Owen Jr., which Owen objected to and Susan insisted on, and Susan won, because she always won these arguments when she had decided the matter was worth winning. And Junior for short became the name everyone used, and Owen stopped objecting when he heard Thomas call the baby "my Junior," with complete natural ownership at age 6. The property in those years had grown into exactly what Susan had originally envisioned. The orchard along the south fence now extended the full length of the fence and partway along the east fence as well, 26 trees bearing fruit from late summer through fall. The vegetable operation was run on a proper rotation with specific sections of the kitchen garden resting and recovering in turns. The chickens had been replaced twice over and were maintained at a steady count of 45 birds, producing more eggs than the family could consume, with the surplus going to the general store and 2 other buyers. The well near the barn had never failed, even in dry years. The adobe house had been extended twice. First, a new bedroom had been added along the north wall when Thomas was born, and then a second room had been added when Margaret came, creating a house that was modest by the standards of the eastern states, but that was solid and well-made and comfortable, and that felt, in every corner, like people lived in it properly. The porch had been rebuilt, the old boards replaced with seasoned pine, the supports reset in fresh adobe, the overhang extended to shade more of the afternoon sun. Owen had built a proper railing along it and fitted a swing that hung from the porch beam. And Susan sat in that swing in the evenings the way she had always sat in the porch chairs, with her coffee and her long view of the valley. Harlow Creek had grown enough by 1893 to have a proper school, a 2-room building on the main road staffed by a teacher named Miss Avery who had come from Ohio and had strong opinions about reading and very little patience for nonsense, which made her exactly the right person for the job. Thomas was already 10 and could read well, but Margaret and Henry attended from the school's first week, and Junior would attend when he was old enough. Susan and Owen were among the families who had pushed for the school, writing to the territorial authority and contributing to the building fund. And the night the school opened, Susan sat on the swing and said, Thomas would have put the school in a better building, which was a gentle and fond and final accounting. Owen sat beside her on the swing, and the night was warm and the valley below had a scatter of lights where 8 years before there had been only dark, more families and more properties, and the stars were still as bright as they had ever been above all of it. "Do you think about him much?" Owen asked. He could ask this now, after 10 years of knowing her. "Not with grief anymore," she said. "With gratitude. He brought me here. Whatever went wrong between the vision and the reality, he brought me to this valley, which is the place I was supposed to be." She looked at the lights in the valley. "And Clifford sent me you, which was Thomas's friendship made into something good after his death. I think about that sometimes." "I think about the scrap of paper," Owen said. She looked at him. The address. "I read it 14 times between Tucson and here because the ink was faded from the fold lines and I was afraid I had the wrong house. I had the right house." He paused. "I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had not been slow that day, if I had been riding fast and had not stopped at the wagon." "You always stopped," she said with certainty. "You are the kind of man who stops." "I did not know that about myself before," he said. "I did," she said, "from the first day." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him the way she always leaned, completely, without holding any of herself back, which was the full measure of her trust, and he knew it and did not take it lightly. The swing moved gently on the warm night, and the valley lights burned below them, and the apple trees rustled in the light evening wind. All 26 of them, the young ones and the old ones in Clifford's row, and the first 6 that Owen had planted in the ground on a day in November when he had told himself he would be gone before they bore fruit, and here he still was. Here he still was, with the fruit, and the children and the woman and the long evenings on the porch. And the only question he had ever had about any of it was why it had taken him so long to stop pretending he could leave. Margaret was 11 when she came to Owen in the kitchen one Saturday morning and asked him with the precise seriousness that was her mother distilled, "Papa, did you always want to stay here or did you have to decide?" He looked at her for a moment. 11 was old enough for the honest answer. "I had to decide," he said. "But once I decided, it was the easiest thing I had ever done." She considered this with the focused attention she brought to everything. "Why was it hard at first?" "Because I was used to leaving," he said. "And leaving is easy. You only have to go. Staying means you have to become the kind of person who can bear what comes with staying." She looked at him. What comes with staying? Everything, he said. All of it. The good and the hard and the ordinary and the beautiful. All of it is yours and you are responsible for it. She thought about this for a long moment in the way she thought, thoroughly and with her head slightly tilted. I like it here, she said finally, which was not exactly a response to what he had said but was perhaps the more fundamental truth behind the question. I know, he said. So do I. She went back out to help her mother with the garden, and Owen stood at the kitchen window and watched Susan out there with Margaret beside her, both of them in their work clothes, both of them with that particular quality of purposeful and practical energy, dark-haired and capable and belonging to this piece of ground. The apple trees were visible along the fence, full-leafed in the summer morning, the early fruit beginning to show in the high branches. He had been given an address on a scrap of paper by a man with broken legs in a doctor's office in Tucson, Arizona Territory, in the autumn of 1882. He had ridden north to a house with a broken gate and a dry irrigation ditch, and a woman who met him with her chin up and her arms loose at her sides, and nothing on her face that was going to let him in easily. He had fixed the gate and the ditch and the roof, and the shingles and the corral fence, and the water rights, and the easement complaint, and the orchard fence, and the well and the chicken house, and every other thing the property offered him to fix. And somewhere in the fixing of those things he had found that he himself had been fixed. The long, aimless drifting ended not by force but by desire, the kind of desire that grows quietly and sets its roots deep before you notice. The way the apple trees had put down roots in the desert ground before anyone saw a single blossom. He had not been able to name the moment he stopped being able to leave. He had thought about it sometimes in those first months, trying to find the specific point, the specific morning or evening or conversation where leaving became impossible. He never found it. It had not been a single moment but an accumulation, the way trust accumulates, the way love accumulates, built from the small repeated things that do not seem like building blocks until you look back and find you are standing in a house you made. He went out to the garden. Susan looked up and saw him, and she smiled, the full, wide smile that was still as startling and as generous as the first time he had caused it in a restaurant in Tucson, and she held out her hand, and he took it, and the morning went on around them, warm and golden and exactly right. Outside the long fence, Harlow Creek went about its business in the bright Arizona morning of 1893. The summer would be hot and the fall would be good for the fruit. Thomas was talking about going to the new agricultural college in Tucson in a few years, wanting to learn the formal science behind what his mother had been doing by instinct and reading on this small, remarkable piece of ground. Margaret was making plans of her own already. Henry was going to take things apart and put them back together for the rest of his life and build something from it. Junior was 3 and running in the yard with the dog they had acquired in a moment of weakness and never regretted. Susan turned back to the garden and Owen stood beside her, and the work was what it had always been, daily and concrete and shared. And the life it was part of was theirs, fully and completely and without reservation. From the apple blossoms in the spring to the cold, clear nights in December with the blankets on the porch, and the stars hammered into the sky above the pale limestone ridges of the valley that had become, without Owen ever having intended it, the only place on earth he had ever wanted to stay.